Hello, I'm Leslie with Cylon Rolling Acres and the education blog Grazing with Leslie, everything related to grazing goats, marketing goats, and also raising goats. Today I have a special guest from Gallagher. Gallagher is one of my favorite fencing companies, especially for goats and sheep. They are much more than just fencing. They have other products as well too that relate to animal management, but fencing is kind of their main jam. Today I have the honor of talking with Ray Williams, who works within the education and training area for Gallagher. He also has a vast experience of working on the technical side of things with training and troubleshooting and working with product development for Gallagher. So we are going to be doing a goat and sheep Q&A. Fencing. All topics are good topics. These questions came in from my online community through grazingwithleslie.com. They were submitted that way. There's a few questions I threw in there of just common questions I get a lot. And I think we'll have a good time and learn a lot. So let's get started. Well, thank you for being here today, Ray. Why don't you start with introducing yourself, a little bit about your background and what you do at Gallagher?
Yeah, well, I've been with Gallagher for about 15 years. I started out in the field with a territory in Nebraska and Kansas, and then moved into the head office in Kansas City to work with our scales and EID systems and measuring, and then pretty good stint in technical support area, ran the technical support in all of our technical services, and then recently just started to work with learning and development. So I have really shifted my role to teaching and working with our teams in the field and customers and dealers and others that are interested in our products and or just the basics and fundamentals. So I spend my day working on modules and videos and all kinds of fun stuff.
Great. Your technical background is a nice fit for teaching and education as well, I bet.
Yeah, you get to see the good, the bad, the ugly when you're in technical support. Most of it's good. There's just challenges and people have questions, and it's just good to kind of interact and be solutions driven. So,
Mhm.
yeah,
Well, that's what it's about, solving problems and
yeah,
getting our work done as farmers and ranchers. So,
absolutely.
all right. So, the first question we'll start with is focused on permanent fencing, which I think is a good place to start. What would you suggest for wire gap or spacing for goats? Maybe how many wires for openings, or in general, what are some good specs for permanent fencing for small ruminants?
Yeah, well, and we all know that goats and sheep are they're hard to contain, and they're like spring-loaded pogo sticks. Sometimes they can
Mm-hmm.
jump and do all kinds of funny things. But when you're building a fence line for goats and sheep, you're using a little bit more wire, more levels of wire. For instance, we like to start out at 6 inches above the ground, go to 10, 16, and 26 inches. So four hot wires that the second or the third wire is at least at their nose. Because as we know that their hair, or if they have a horn or whatever, is not as conductive as it is on the bridge of their nose and such. So when they get shocked or when they get pulse, we want to make sure it's on the bridge of their nose. So the only consideration that you would want is if kids are getting underneath the fence line, if you've got little ones there, you might have to go a little bit lower on that and add another wire at the bottom, which we'll kind of talk about, some of the good, the bad, the ugly of that, because it does come in contact with some of the foliage underneath. But those levels, the 6, 10, 16, and 26, are really ideal for sheep and goat. And yeah, the Energizers,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what your thoughts are there, but I usually recommend that at least one Joule Energizer for about every mile and such,
Mm-hmm.
because they do need to have a pretty stout pulse when they do hit that fence, so it's memorable and they just don't shrug it off. Um, we sell a number of Energizers that fit that bill really well, and they're portable. That if it's out in the field, they're solar, or if you can, ideally, it's nice to have an Energizer that you can plug into AC because that has the most output for the money, if you will. But
Mm-hmm.
yeah, that's the spacing is huge, and you can use if it's a permanent fence line. High tensile wire is ideal. It's the most conductive. If it's more of a temporary situation, then like a turbo wire, which is a
Mm-hmm.
braided plastic with metal strands inside, extremely tough and very, very durable, but very, very effective on the shock. So it just depends on the situation that way. But
On the we talking about strands. What about woven wire? Is there any parameters that are helpful? I know there's a lot of options.
Well, as far as woven wire, do you mean like if the fence already has woven wire on it, or are you putting metal woven wire on the fence
Let's,
line?
I'd say like putting woven wire up.
Yeah, I mean, a typical sheep fence that you can purchase is ideal. It has the squares. I'm not quite sure how many inches per hole they are, but I know that they get smaller at the bottom and larger at the top. But those are for a perimeter fence. Those are ideal. And then typically you can take an offset, what we call an offset, off of that main line, and then if you're going to do cross pasturing or across a field, you can take off of a live wire that is attached to a permanent woven fence as well. Yeah, but when it's not hot, if it's a woven wire fence, of course it's just a barrier at that point. It's just going to keep them where they need to be, and then just cross fence from there if you need to.
And when you talked about the multi-strands, like high tensile fence, that can be a useful fencing setup for sheep and goats as well. I
Yeah,
think a lot of folks think they have to have woven wire, but
no.
it multi-strand definitely
Ideally, yeah, ideally,
more.
if go ahead, I'm sorry.
Oh, no, I was just going to say multi-strand, high tensile fence with the right number of strands can be a doable option for sheep and goats too.
Absolutely. Absolutely. If you electrified or not, that particular spacing is quite effective to keep them where they need to be as a physical barrier. If you've got lines that are actually electrified, then that is the premium product at that point on a perimeter fence.
And now this question did ask about energizers as well, but you kind of touched on that already. But one thing, based on what you had mentioned, you kind of gave a rule of thumb of how much joules per fence line. Does that change at all with using sheep and goat fencing, just knowing that there's more hot wire lines, let's say, compared to like a fence you might just use for cattle, whether that's portable or permanent?
Well, there's a really interesting phenomena that occurs with electric fencing, and the more lines of fence you have, the more conductive that it actually is.
Well,
It's
interesting.
kind of fun because the electrical impulse doesn't go through the wire on the inside like a typical AC electric in your wall does. It rolls on the outside, so more surface area is your friend. So the more wire that you have, it actually amplifies the effectiveness of your shock when you connect a standard energizer to it. But with all that said, we want it to be a memorable shock with sheep and goat because again they're harder to contain than cattle. I can run a single wire around a corn stalk field and they'll be just fine. They
Mm-hmm.
touch it once or twice and they're done. They don't bother it anymore. They see the perimeter and it's a psychological barrier, and that's really the same for sheep and goat as well. I mean, they get stung a couple of times. They're not going to bother it much anymore anyway. They're going to see it and just avoid it. But you don't want to have the instance of them breaking through that. If the Energizer isn't strong enough or large enough, and we're not getting, let's say, if we're getting below 4,000 volts, kilovolts, they may shrug it off. We're looking to get up in the 7 to 9,000 volt area. So once it stings, it's a once and done, and they are trained then not to go near it again. So it's critical that the Energizer is sized appropriate to the length. And honestly, if you're going to put up a system like this, you kind of think in terms of what am I going to do in the future as well. So don't cheat yourself and buy a small Energizer because this is what I'm doing today, and think in terms of what I'm going to expand to and then buy that Energizer for that size, and then you can take off and do what you need to do without having to go. We sell a lot of Energizers in different increments, so just think in terms of the type of space that I'm going to be doing and the length of my fence line, and just buy the Energizer that's appropriate. So 1 joule per mile
Mm-hmm.
is kind of the rule of thumb.
And then that's good to know then that applies really no matter which type of fencing setup you're doing for species wise.
Right. Exactly. As I mentioned, you can get away with a lot less with cattle. So
Mm-hmm.
we're going to go a little bit higher value or higher intensity with sheep and goat, and with a 1 joule per mile type situation.
Okay. Oh, good. This rolls right well, or right good. This rolls well into the next question on energizers in terms of power and so forth. So you mentioned how hot the fence should be for sheep and goats.
Yeah.
7 to 9 kilovolts, 5 minimum. How should you be? What's the best way to monitor that and
Yeah.
making sure that it's effective? And can you talk a little bit about that for
Right.
power wise?
Well, one of your essential tools to have in your pocket is an electric fence tester, because I mean, once you put up a system and you're getting it all ready to go, you want to test it periodically at the beginning, the middle, and the end of the fence line to make sure that it's consistently over 6 kilovolts throughout. And I know that sometimes there's confusion about grounding or whatever it might be, but nothing really happens to the animal until the animal makes the bridge or the between the fence and the ground, right? And so you need a hot fence that's got lots of power potential there, and then as it goes through the animal, through its hoof, into the ground and finds the energizer, and that instant it makes that connection and delivers the shock. So the higher that value is, the higher potential value that you have coming out of the energizer, the better. And most all of the energizers you buy, whether you buy our product or anybody else's, is going to render about 7,000 per unit, no matter what size it is. And so any of the resistance or interference that you have on a fence line, which can be weeds or other obstacles and such, need to be checked out before you put the animals into the area. And that tester is your friend, because you can actually, instead of guessing, and I've heard lots of great stories about how people test fence, and I don't. It's all.
Yes, I agree. The handheld tester is a much better option
Yes, it is.
and
Yes.
safer.
Yeah.
So when you talk about higher potential value, how do you kind of gauge that if you're looking at either upgrading an Energizer or buying a new one?
Yeah. So as I mentioned, Energizers come in various sizes and right in the sweet spot. And then a lot of people buy about a 1 joule fencer or larger for pastures and paddocks that are going to be subdivided and have a perimeter fence to wire up to. And 1 joule will go for miles. Actually, be a 1 joule fencer will actually energize for miles. You're basically not overkill, because nobody's ever called me and said, "Hey Ray, my Energizer's too hot."
Mhm.
It's like I want to get the most potential out of my Energizers. And there's not a lot of price variance between a 1 joule and a 1.5 or even a 2 joule fence.
Mhm.
So buy in looking at your project and what you plan to do, if you're rotationally grazing or if you're just trying to get a great perimeter fence, we don't recommend anything less than a 1 joule, or at well, maybe a zero point 0.8 joule, like
Mhm.
a solar S80 is a zero point 0.8 joule, and those work extremely well. But yeah, that sweet spot is about a 1 joule per mile. And there's always things that we need to do, to prevent leakage off of a fence. When you're testing and you're trying to figure out what's wrong, double check that there isn't a huge branch or tree piece that's coming up into the fence line. You'll see it as you're putting the fence up, but even on a periodic basis, you go out and you clean that up a little bit. I take a gas-powered weed eater out and just get rid of some of the biggest stuff. But
Mhm.
and it's not the end of the world if you have a little bit of grass coming up into the fence line. It's just that we don't want anything major coming up, and especially in wet areas, you want to make sure you've got it so it doesn't detract too far of the energy off of the fence line.
Okay. And now if you talked about like if the kilovolts drop from where you were at before, is that usually attributed to that interference?
It is. And if it's drastically lower, let's say it's below 3000 kV, you want to start looking for, if it's a high tensile fence or any kind of a fence that's attached to posts or wood or metal posts and such. You want to look for insulators that are actually damaged. And your tester will allow you to go down the line and kind of see where it's bad. And sometimes you'll hear a short before
Mhm.
you'll see it. You can hear it, snapping on each pulse. So make the repair, test it again. You're usually okay. We can go through, testing gates and anything that kind of interrupts the fence line. You want to check all those areas too to make sure there's just not some kind of an interruption or some kind of failure there. But we're really, really trying to keep that well above 5 to 6 to 7,000 kV. And gosh, if you get into a pinch, just give us a call and we'll work through kind of a process of checking the fence in the
Mhm.
field. You've got good cell service and whatnot, because there's usually a reason for it. One of the things that I wanted to mention, though, in this particular question is grounding is absolutely paramount to be considering.
Mhm.
Think of grounding as half of the Energizer, basically. So a 3-foot ground rod with a T handle on the top that you can push into the ground as far as you can get it is good for about a 1 mile fencer, or that much length of fence line. Ideally, I tell people to put in more than one, up to three,
Mhm.
and space them 10 feet apart and then hook them all together with one wire, one galvanized wire back to the Energizer. Those T-rod 3-foot ground rods are easy enough to pull up out of the ground, and they can be pounded into the ground. And I know it's when we're building permanent fence, we like to put in 6-foot ground rods, 10 feet apart. But if you're doing, depending on what your situation is, if you're trying to do temporary fencing or whatnot, you just kind of watch that. And if you still can't, if there's no obstruction, there's nothing that's bothering your fence line, and you find that it's still running lower than normal, lower than 4 kV, then add another ground rod. And I bet you're going to find that it's going to improve it, because that's definitely going to be your friend when you are trying to, if you're in dry, arid soil or whatnot, it's the best situation. Usually in wet areas, one ground rod is going to be great. It's going to be conductive and whatnot and get back to the Energizer.
Now those T grounding rods are great. I think the first time we were using a portable setup outside of our permanent pasture, I was trying to use the traditional ones, and I'm like, this isn't working. But those T ones are great for when you have to move your setup. So I second that.
Yeah.
So on the grounding side of things, we'll kind of roll into some of those questions too. So like I have a lot of times when I will share our use of using the smart fence or
Yeah.
the net fence, sometimes people are like, how is that not grounding out? Because the fence is so close to the grass. Can you talk a little bit about that question and like how that works? And then how do you kind of remedy or make your setup, your environment, so it's not grounding out as probably as much as what maybe somebody might think it would be?
Right. So that fence netting is designed so the bottom wire is not electrified. So you do have a bit of space at the bottom that, some forgiveness area. The only downside with netting is you have to periodically check it, because if it gets slack and kind of sags a little bit and that second wire up does touch the ground or gets into a lot of grass and whatnot, that can take away from the fence. But with a good 3-foot ground rod and with just making sure that the fence is nice and up off the ground, you're going to put that bottom wire in contact with the ground without having any detraction from the fence at all. So it's designed for that purpose. As a physical barrier, it's awesome. And then with the intensity that we have in those nets, because they're all turbo wire, which is a much higher conductivity than a polywire tent or a polywire net, kind of be watching for that you want the most metal content in those lines as you can get. The ones that we sell are all turbo wire, which was our premium product. It's 48 times more conductive than a regular polywire is. So when you're troubleshooting those nets, and you can put, we tell people you can put up to 4, maybe more nets together, because I mentioned early on about the surface area of all those lines. It works extremely well with Energizers that are the 1 joule and close to it and better. And they can deliver a great intensity. And then when you tie those nets together, just kind of watch the bottom as you put the post into the ground, the step in, that the wire is not falling down below where it's supposed to stop. Sometimes they get caught, and that second wire up can get jogged underneath one of the posts and such. So you have to make sure that they're all nice and up above the ground, and it should work brilliantly after that.
And I know with those fences too, and even with a smart fence too, I find that, and this is kind of what you talked about before, is if I'm somewhere where we're moving to a new paddock, I will oftentimes either take a quick mow of the future path that we're going to be at, or if it's like our hayfield or our pasture, I may even take our UTV and make beat down a line and then put in the fence just to minimize any extra grounding in addition to that too. So.
Right. Exactly.
All right. And then, okay, so on the grounding topics related to grounding rods, I know you talked about kind of rule of thumb, but I get this question too. Do you have to use grounding rods?
Yes. So the whole idea is that to complete the circuit, so the animal gets the shock, the power is going through the fence line, and it has to find its way to ground, and then the electron flies through the ground and finds the ground rod, which is connected to the other side of the Energizer. So you have the hot and the ground side of an Energizer. So in order to complete that circuit, there has to be a bridge between the fence and the ground, and that's the animal, right? So if you don't have good grounding or a ground rod, nothing will happen. That's why birds, you can touch a fence line. If it doesn't have any grounding, you can do all kinds of stuff. And the Energizer's on. If you're in rubber boots or you're insulated in a way, you won't feel the sense of shock. But when the ground rods are connected and then it's connected to the Energizer, the bridge or the connection is the animal. That's the moment and this all happens at the speed of light. So it's
Hmm.
pretty darn quick. The thing about ground rods is that the more the better. And they're like the antenna. If you consider
Hmm.
like a big TV with rabbit ears is not going to get good reception, right? So you put the biggest antenna you can on it, or you connect it to something that's going to give you a stream. But the point is that it's waiting for that electron to catch it and deliver it to the Energizer so the shock occurs. And if there's not enough of them, the electron could go zinging right past the ground rod, and you won't get as much of a shock as you would if you have more of them out there. So again, we mentioned that one ground rod per mile is good. It's fine depending on the soil. If it's really dry soil, don't be afraid. Those ground rods are really inexpensive, and just put in 3 of them in a row,
Hmm.
10 feet apart, connected with one galvanized wire back to the Energizer, and that's a good catcher's mitt. It's going to catch an electron and deliver that shock just like it's supposed to do.
Great. Thank you for covering that. All right. So some of the next questions I have are a little bit specific to the farmer's location, but I think there probably can be some things to learn for folks who are from similar environments or setups or regions. So this question is, I live in Eastern Tennessee and almost everything is up and down. I literally use crampons to do fences. What suggestions do you have for a type of fence and post that won't break the bank for a terrain like this?
Yeah, well, for terrain, the fiberglass posts are really a good deal for that. The way you anchor a terrain area as you're going up a hill, you want to have a solid anchor at the top of the hill,
Mhm.
whether that be a wood post or a T-post or something to that effect. And then at the bottom of the terrain, because and what we see sometimes is you'll be going through a trough or a gully or whatever you want to call it. And so you want to have a solid anchor at the bottom as well that's not going to come out. So you have to find ways to get that really solid in the bottom. But so and then from there, as you come up the hill, everything will work just fine. And if you put in, let's say, like I said, fiberglass posts are not that expensive. 3/8 posts are not that expensive, and they have clips that you can put in them. And run up the hill to the top, and then as you descend or go across the level plane, then you can go back to what you were doing before. But that's the best recommendation
Mhm.
is just that top anchor and that bottom anchor at the top and bottom of the hill, and that'll keep it from sagging and giving you trouble that way. And you can tighten it up pretty much by hand and whatnot. So
Thank you. It's a good question. Where I live, we have rolling hills, but nothing like that extreme. So, all right. So this question is: I run on all lease ground. A lot is really thick and covered with thorny brush we call greasewood. The property is next to a busy highway, so I use electronet. What is the most efficient or best way to clear paths for electric net? I don't own a tractor.
yeah, I guess what I've seen folks do is if they invest in a gas powered weed eater or something that they can walk along the path with and just create a path where the fence might be. I mean, if you can get it down to ankles height, is usually good enough.
Hmm.
Sometimes just because of terrain and big trees and whatnot and bushes that you can't get around, you really have to be flexible about how you do that. But running it through tall grass and lots of brush and such is really not your friend. It's not gonna work as well. It may look like a physical barrier, but your ability to shock an animal is not going to be as good unless it's got a clear way. So when they come up to it or eat up to it, they are clear at the bottom. Especially for sheep and goat, you want that near the bottom to be hot as much as you can. I mean, you can flex that up a little bit if you need to be up a little bit higher than 6 inches, especially if they're mature animals. We're really going to be the sweet spot is about nose height at that 16 and 24-inch height is where we really have to have it at good. So yeah, you can just use your best judgment there, but the bottom line is just a flexible line that just kind of move it over in a grove and use whatever device you have available to you for clearing as much of the tallest stuff out of the way. But um, that's about the best you can do at that point is just to give you a little bit of an egress around and to put that fence in like that.
Yeah, I think I was thinking about this one too, and I think depending on the type of brush, we have a handheld, or it's like a steel machine that it's kind of like an like a amped up weed eater, but it's got a brush head on it that is just by
Yeah.
hand. That sometimes that can work well on foot for clearing brush. Even in our like in our part of the country, we've got. Go ahead,
No, no,
you're
I
gonna
was
say
just
something.
thinking if they don't have a tractor, if they've
Mm-hmm.
got a pickup
Mm-hmm.
or an ATV or anything like that, you can drag. My dad and I used to use a piece of chain link fence strapped to
Mm-hmm.
a post and then tied it to the hitch and drug it along the ground where the fence is going to be, and it knocks down a lot of the stuff there.
Mm-hmm.
Got to kind of get creative, but
Mm-hmm.
you can drag across that terrain to knock things down is definitely a good way to do it too. So just use what you've got and think in terms of what do I have that I can hook to and just kind of pull along to kind of make that job a lot easier if you can.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. In our part of the country in Wisconsin, we have a lot of buckthorn, which is
Oh
a
yeah.
problem. And we've been working on that in our woods. In some areas, it's super big buckthorn trees, which is different than little shoots. And so when we were starting to graze in there, we thought about where we wanted to graze seasonally. And
Hmm.
then actually went in and took down, made like paths that we always would make paddocks with, kind of thinking long term versus more flexible with the season like you would do with the traditional grazing. But even that, if you knew how you might do it, maybe you can find somebody to let you borrow the equipment, or
Yeah.
you could rent something just to make your life easier going forward without needing to have the equipment all the time
Right.
too.
Well, yeah, and in the spring of the season when you're getting ready to put them out, you get that let them let it grow a little bit so you can get to it all. But it may be something you do maybe twice in a season just to kind of clean it up a little bit. If you notice that, honestly, at the beginning of that time, if the fence is clear and if the animals have a chance to be trained against it, time to be, they usually don't bother the fence after a period of time, after
Hmm.
they know that it is something that they have to avoid. So that part is really good. They usually memory is good on a shock like that they don't.
Yes. All right. Well, the next questions, we're going to move to a Gallagher specific product. I had a couple questions related to this. So this is related to the smart fence. We use
Sure.
that a lot on our farm, and have really sing the praises of it. I love
Yeah.
the net fence, especially the sheep fence, but it's there's something that's a little more seamless about the smart fence.
Yeah.
But there's different situations and different areas where each tool, merits it. But so just talk with the first question. They said, I've been using the fast fence, which I'm assuming they're talking about the smart fence. And sometimes the reels are stiffer to pull them in at times. Is there any way to lubricate the wheels? Do you have any suggestions or tips related to that? The kind of that once it's kind of been in use?
Right. So uh, because of the way it's designed, and it is a friction-based grab,
Hmm.
and what's unique about the smart fence is when you're cranking it, um, get after it. I mean, get some crank going because there is a point where if one line has slack in it and the others don't, it will actually let that one, it'll pull everything else, which has resistance on it. But I know that if it's really difficult to turn and they're really sticking together, you can use a dry silicone lubricant. They call it dry silicone lubricant between them. You don't want to use anything that's too wet because it will cause buildup and all kinds of problems with it that way. Just utilizing the handle or the turn knob on the side and just kind of adjusting and then just crank it. You should be able to hold on to that mast and be able to crank it and pull that fence in really rapidly without
Hmm.
too much trouble. And then after a period of time, I mean, listen, if they've had it for a long time and they're really having problems with it, or if they let's say you break a wire in one of them,
Hmm.
that can be repaired. You can do it. You can put a tiny, tie it together and then heat it up and melt it together, and that'll get through uh, the little piece that the wire comes through to get lodged into the reel. But for the most part, you can dry lubricate them. Really experiment with the knob on the side to create the friction, and then just hold on to it tight and pull it in as much as you can like a fishing rod. We love those units. They sell amazingly across the world. They're ideal for putting up a fence fast, and the way that they're spaced on that are really not too bad for sheep and goat. We have lots of
Hmm.
customers that use them for that. Yeah, use a good Energizer on them that's got at least a zero point 0.8 joule to 1 joule on them if you need to, and a 3-foot ground rod clipped to it, to the ground and into the Energizer, and they usually are just really, really easy to work with. But what I was going to say is we have parts for them. If somebody has a problem with one and one of them breaks, yeah, we stock literally every part on that unit. So we can usually get it fixed for you if you decide that it's broken to the point where you need to have it looked at. We have that all here in Kansas City.
That's it. Yeah, I've ordered parts and redone replacements on things, so I've been glad to be
Yeah,
able to do that because ours have been around for a while. And I know like one of the other questions was like it's hard to crank at times, which I know is similar to kind of that other question about stiffer. I've noticed mine sometimes that are older that maybe they have more debris in them or
yeah.
just from being outside. Does the lubricant help with that, or is it merit to do any more cleaning to them? Is there anything else that can kind of help with that functionality of reeling it?
Yeah, there's if you look at the smart fence on the outer shroud, there's a little black tension unit there that
Mhm.
actually is putting tension on the wire so it doesn't get all crazy on you. Just double check that there isn't any debris in those. You can get in there and kind of pick around and
Are
usually
those
clear
like
those out.
that little black thing? It's like kind of like a square or a rectangle with like an oval end on it
Yeah, yeah.
on the orange part. Okay.
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm talking about. What we found is that those can get some debris in them and such and can be problematic. But usually you can see it.
Hmm.
But other than that, just put the dry lubricant in there. That usually keeps them from getting hung up. And
Hmm.
then pull it out when it's, undo the tension on it and pull out the length of it for a bit and then reel it back in when you tighten it back up again. Usually will be enough to keep it working pretty good for years to come. Luckily, we don't have that many problems with them. And what we do have, we can get them fixed immediately and
Hmm.
get you back in business. So it's certainly not a lost cause if one of them's not working quite right. We can get you fixed just like brand new again.
Well, and for how much we've used ours and for how long, I figure like anything, sometimes they need a little maintenance or
Yeah,
there's common maybe just over the years troubleshooting that you guys are probably more familiar with, like you were just talking about, like for tweaks to
yeah,
improve improvements. So.
truly, truly.
And I still use that fence, but it sure beats hauling that fence around. So I'll take a little troubleshooting now and then.
Yeah,
Related to the smart fence, one other question about posts. That someone had talked about they had some challenges with post bending or the step in area with they called it nail portion, but like the stake that goes in the ground.
yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about use to try to minimize some of that bending with those posts? In their situation, they talked about the ground wasn't hard, but I'm sure there's probably some techniques for usage that might help with maintaining the integrity of those.
Yeah, if you're in, let's say, rock ground and you're having trouble getting them stomped into the ground, I usually take a 3/8 inch rod and pound in first and pull out and then stick stick the nail into it.
Hmm.
They're pretty robust in the sense that you can usually use a hammer if you take one with you in your backpack and pound it back out and to flatten it back out to where it's supposed to be. The bending post, it is designed, those nylon posts are designed to be bent. They are fairly flexible. We've had a couple of customers break them, so those can be replaced without too much trouble, and they're just a few dollars a piece. They're not that bad. The worst part of that is just rethreading the whole fence for it
Hmm.
when you do that. But bending is not a problem normally if they're concerned. It's specific that your question is specific to the smart fence. It's not other posts that we sell or that are out there that are
Hmm.
bending. Um,
Yeah, this was related to the smart fence.
yeah, yeah. So if it's like on a corner, I can think of a great example. If you're putting guy wires out on a corner and you're making a 90 degree, sometimes that post will bend back towards the guy wire, and that's okay. It's when they've been bent clear over and they're stressed at that point that they kind of remain that way, and you just kind of have to push them back and just kind of work with them a little bit. But for the most part, yeah, I don't have too many posts that break in the field that we've noticed over the years, but the spikes can get bent and just bend them back and hopefully again if it gets to be a problem where they're just completely broken or not working, we can replace those posts anytime you want.
And I would imagine that, like, as you are setting up the fence, if you still want tension so you can reel it out, but if you don't have it super tight, that will also help with maybe putting too much tension on the posts as you're getting the whole fence set up, if that makes sense. I'm just thinking about going around a corner sometimes.
Yeah.
having it too tight, as you're saying, that might
Yeah, that is true.
pressure
And
on there.
we we think we have to have a fence that is like a tar strings, and we don't. They don't have to be super uber tight, because there's very little pressure on the fence, right? Because the
Hmm.
animal comes in contact, gets shocked, and runs away. So typically, we just try to just keep them up off the ground, the bottom wires off the ground, just lightly tight on the rest of the fence works great, and then just use the handle to tighten it up as you go when you're done putting up the smart fence. And usually that tension is just enough, just so it doesn't bend all the corner posts out too far. Yeah, that's the good thing is, like I mentioned, is that there's not a lot of pressure on the fence, collisions and that type of thing. If it's a hot fence at that point, they're going to get shocked and run away from it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think like with these specific questions and some of the information you talked before about troubleshooting, I think I'll do is after
Yeah.
the call, I'll get contact the information for from Gallagher, the best place to call for
Yeah.
either troubleshooting or getting parts. I'll include that
Yeah,
at the end of
absolutely.
this video as well.
No problem.
So next question is about moving animals. So this is more like moving within fencing, but I figured you might have some ideas as well too. How do you get them where you want to go if it's not adjacent to where they are? And I think the question is really about rotational grazing and moving from one paddock to another. A lot of times we'll flow from one paddock to the next, but what kind of suggestions do you might have in this type of situation?
Yeah, so uh, you create a lane, basically, a temporary lane, and this is where a smart fence could work well, or just putting in some temporary posts that you can create a 10-foot or whatever lane that you have. And usually, and you know more about this than I do, but you usually have one of the animals that's kind of a lead animal, right? And in most herds, there's usually a lead animal that everybody else follows. And I saw this done, and it was just remarkable, where they took the lead animal on harness, and they led them down this alleyway that was built with hot wire on both sides, gave the herd enough space to get in there, but then led that animal through and then out to the next paddock where they were supposed to go. And it worked brilliantly. They all followed, and it was great. If that isn't the case, because that's going to be the next problem, is getting the pressure enough to get them to move forward.
Hmm.
And so incentivization on the front side, whether it be a flake or grain or peanuts or whatever it is that they love, especially with goats, they love peanuts. Just anything that can get them to move. And if they stay within the confines of a lane that is built, that is the most ideal way to move a herd quickly and efficiently into another pasture that might be already fenced up and ready to go. So,
Yeah, I'd agree. When we have been in those situations, I will usually use a lane. I try to make it a little bit, big enough
yeah.
so there's not pressure they get, out. But it's and whenever I move my animals, even if it's not a situation like that, I kind of build in, I call them, and so they kind of get used to like the
Hmm.
anticipation of what's next. So I think if there's some patterns like that, or kind of like you talked about the leash or the snack or the
Yeah.
special treat, we started. You don't have to have a border collie, but we started using it. We have a herding dog
Yeah.
on our farm, and because our rotations are fairly seamless, she doesn't get probably as much work as she probably could in other situations, but she is really good when we are moving them through an area to just walk with me behind the herd, and then they
Yeah.
will naturally want to get away from her
True.
and we'll go
Truly.
to where's next.
No, that's
Hmm.
absolutely great. That works so good.
So next question is, my property is hilly and it is very little flat terrain. This person is from Alaska. I'm interested in grazing meat goats on the perimeter of my farm to help keep cottonwood, birch, and weed pressure down. What's the best electric fence system for a small herd of goats that I want to move daily or every couple days? And then there's some other parts to this question, which I know you probably looked at, but I can follow up with some of those other questions as we kind of get through this portion of.
How large of an area that they've got that they want to graze. The 160-foot roll of sheep net works great for that, and
Mhm.
adding additional nets to it if necessary to get the length. And there's kind of some people make them into circles, some will just follow the ground and the ladder and come around obstacles with it and such. And a lot of people love that, and they can graze them and move them with some intensity if necessary. But for the most part, just some kind of a situation like that, smart fence is an ideal way to do that. But if they've got younger animals and such, the smart fence is probably, or not the smart fence, but rather the netting is probably your best option for that.
Hmm.
Unless they're going to put in some permanent, yeah, if they're just transmoving from one pasture to an next or just grazing for a period of time, that's your best option.
So their second part of this is how tall should the fence be and how likely are they to respect the fence? I have a lot of vegetable gardens that I can't get them into. I'm only laughing because I have these concerns at home and I hear stories all the time, which I'm sure you do. It's not a funny situation, but I have to chuckle. But we have moose fence around most of these gardens. Everyone
Yes.
I talk to in Alaska says cattle panels work better. I really want a simple, efficient system that I can move easily as I have 1 million other tasks to do. So any thoughts kind of on to add on to what you talked about before, given this context or the question about height and having them respect it?
Yeah. Well, moose are, yeah, as you can imagine, I'm sure that they are a menace when they see something, or, them moving towards a garden fence is, I'm sure, just like, yeah, that smells and looks great.
Mhm.
But you want to keep it's like a sheep fence or a goat fence, a bit of a distance from the garden moose fence. When moose come charging or come walking towards it, they encounter the electric fence first. 35 to 42 inches is usually the recommended height for those fences, those electric fences. So typically, just giving there enough of a distance between the big fence, the moose fence, and the electric fence is usually pretty good. The other thought is I want to make sure I understood your question too. This is a co-situation with sheep and goat getting close to the garden fence as well. Are this moose fence is a permanent installation, perhaps? I wonder.
I think so. I'm going off the question. So
Yeah,
I think there's that, but I also think what kind of fences are enough to keep goats in and respect it so they don't get it into the garden, I think is
yeah.
maybe more so because I think what you talked about with the moose is a good might cover that piece enough.
Well, yeah. Just give yourself a lot of egress between the goat fence. They're going to be tempted. So along the perimeter of a garden, I would definitely use a sheep fence, a roll of sheep fence to kind of create the permanent physical barrier as well. And just so there isn't a temptation for them to jump it, sometimes you can put this is the way we deterred sheep from jumping, or I mean rather deer from jumping into gardens, is we'll put up the permanent or the net in the back and then put a single wire about 18 to 20 inches away from the fence, the sheep fence as an example, and we tie that into the hot wire as well. So it's just one single line. It's about nose height. So they come up to it, they might look at that and say, okay, I don't have the depth perception to jump that. So they don't jump it because they might try to get to it no matter what. But if you create a 3D fence, what they call a 3D fence, where you put a single wire in front of the existing sheep net or other fencing, that works amazing. They won't jump it. It's crazy how it just works great
Oh,
because none of
interesting.
these
So
animals have great depth perception. They don't if it's confusing to them, they'll hold back on it. We've got some folks that are trying that right now, and they said it's been working really well where they put that 3D fence up where they put one single line in the front on a smaller post. Nothing fancy, but it is a hot wire, and they come up, they graze up to it, and they get stung right there, but they still see the physical barrier. They're not tempted to jump over and get to the garden
mhm.
at that point.
Oh, great suggestion. I was amazed how much there is a lot of similarities with at least I with goats and deer.
Yeah, I know.
Just a side note on they asked about fence height. Is there a fence height in general with goats and sheep that tends to be enough? Some
Yeah,
people might say there's never enough, but
there's
like
never enough.
what's
Yeah. So, for the rule of thumb, the best practice is 42 inches is the
Mhm.
height of one of these fences. Anything more than that is probably, depending on the situation, it's more likely that they're not going to jump over that
Mhm.
um, unless we not because they graze up to these fences, right? So they typically graze up to them and get stung if they get too close, and they back away. Um, if they're being rushed by a predator as an example, and they're jumping anything they get in front of or running across and around, there's a potential that they might jump a 42-inch fence, as you can imagine. But for the mite, 99% of the time, a 42-inch fence is usually just enough. 35 to 45, 35 to 42 inches is the best practice.
Yeah, and I think your comment about using the net fence is maybe a good situation, especially when you think about wildlife. For us, like when we graze in our woods, we don't, well, we have moose in Wisconsin, but probably not as prevalent as Alaska and is not as much in our area. But we have a lot of white-tailed deer, and I find that I feel more comfort with the effectiveness of the net fence out in our woods because even if a deer jumped it and it goes down slightly, there's still a physical barrier. So if I'm
Hmm.
checking it daily, I should be able to maintain it versus like a single strand or multi-strand. It may go down more, and then
Right,
that presents a bigger challenge as well.
right, right. Yeah, and if you're not dealing with sheep or goat, then a three wire fence is perfect for deer because you have two wires in the back and the one wire in the front, 30 inches away from the back fence. They won't jump that, but your sheep and goat will run right through it unless you have something more physical behind it.
Yep. And I would also say in this situation too, just because I don't know, I mean, I will say I don't live in Alaska, so I know there's a lot more environmental
Yes.
factors that to come into play. But the idea of having to have a tall enough fence or moving cattle panel around and goats won't respect it. I will say to a certain degree, some things that really help is making sure your goats are fence trained to respect the electric fence. And for us in Wisconsin, because our animals aren't using it all year round. We always do like a retraining in the spring, and that helps tremendously because, kind of like you talked about before, once they understand how that pulse works, they don't put a lot of pressure on it.
Yeah, that's a great point, Leslie. I mean, I that's something that everybody does need to know if they can take the time to train their animals to an electric fence, is the outcomes are so much better and
Hmm.
a lot less uh, aggravating when they get through it if they don't have some idea what it is initially.
Yep. And always make sure it's on and hot. I think
Yes.
sometimes it's easy with net fencing to say, oh, like it's visually there, they respect it. But I think the only time I've run into trouble with net fence is when I've left it off and I've never done it again. So I'm not, shouldn't laugh at the situation, but I kind of chuckle like it's like I should have known better, but
Yes.
you live
Yes.
and learn. All right. So we're kind of got a couple more questions left. This one is from somebody in Illinois. I have an additional 4 acres of pasture that doesn't have any trees nearby. I was wanting to know which electric fence would be best for me. I'm new to goat farming. I bought an old cattle farm that has been vacant for over 25 years, so it has a lot of work to do. I want something that's cost effective yet keep the goats in. I don't want to chase them. Can understand that. Any ideas or suggestions would be greatly appreciated. And as we talk about this, I would imagine, or we can maybe make some assumptions that maybe there might be some existing fencing, but maybe not. But so that might influence too, like how you might, or one might tackle that project too. But I'll let
Yeah.
you go ahead and talk a little bit about that type of situation.
Well, ideally, if let's say they do have a good existing perimeter fence, and you can put an offset that is uh, connected to the existing fence that offsets, several inches away, and put a hot wire in it at whatever height that you want, especially if goats and sheep are going to be involved, at that 24 to 24 26 inch level, and then from there, you can use that hot wire to create smaller paddocks down the road, and smaller sections off of that main line. And what I try to say is that if they've got the ability to plug an energizer in, as I mentioned early on, into an outlet in a shed, because those have to be undercover, and
Hmm.
then run a lead out cable to that permanent or that perimeter fence that's got that line that goes all the way around, that's the best situation you can have. Now, again, that still allows you to move the fence and use that perimeter as a physical barrier, but move an electric fence down that line to create smaller paddocks and rotational grazing if you want. And that's very cost effective. The second way, of course, is to have an independent system that is out there by itself with a solar panel or solar energizer and ground rods that are with it and all that, and to just create the area for the animals to graze. The whole idea is that if they need water, we almost have to have a central area that we can create fencing to and create pie shapes or whatever we need to allow them to get to water if there's a centralized area. But as they develop the property and they start to get into it and they start to look at it, to draw it all out and just kind of understand what they're working with initially, I find that even with a shabby perimeter fence, if it's not in great repair, because it's so expensive to repair and replace perimeter fencing, right? So if I can attach a hot wire or more to that existing fence, I can then create a solid perimeter and then use that wire to electrify other areas within that pasture area and create little pockets of area that they can graze and then move them again as you needed to. So the netting works great for that. The smart fence works great for that. Just something that's easy for them to move when they want to move their animals. But there's best systems are the ones that have, and the most economical way is to make sure that the perimeter has some kind of wire on it, some kind of hot wire on it that I can utilize for other projects in the center.
No, great. Our fencing system for our permanent fence is very similar structure, though we don't have, it's not old cattle, but we have that one line of hot wire that we will build our paddock fencing off of, which has worked really well. And it's actually powered by Energizer in the barn. So
Yeah,
it was
that's ideal.
suggestion from our installer, who is also a Gallagher, sells Gallagher products too, but he does a lot with sheep and goats. So it was a great suggestion for that. And I think sometimes, even when you're adapting a situation too, I think being able to use some of these portable systems or add on to what's existing, even if it's not ideal for the long run, is a good way to get a feel of how things work. Because I think back to my journey as raising our animals and grazing, there's a lot of things I would do differently with our setup. There's some things we waited on, and I'm glad we did, because once you start to understand your management practices or how you might use fencing, then you can kind of adapt or add on later down the road. And those portable tools or those add-on pieces like you talked about with the fence are really great options.
No, and this goes back to the point about training the animals again, the training pin initially to get them used to it. They're especially in a brand new paddock or brand new area that they've never been in. This is really critical that they know what they're up against, and that way you have less frustration when you're trying to build these smaller areas that they can be grazing in for sure.
Exactly. So the last question I have, and then I have a couple of wrap-up things, I think was maybe a joke, but I'm laughing because if anybody has built sheep and goat fencing, you know that it is an investment, which I think you know as well. But the question is, how about the best tactic to get someone to pay my $20K fencing fee? Do you have, but maybe if you can talk a little bit about ways people can like do it yourself or keep projects economical yet effective as they're getting started. And then I have a few things that I might add to it, but I'll let you kind of touch on that to some extent.
Well, that's a real deal. 20 grand for a fencing project is not, we consider what it costs for a mile of fence these days is just about that much. But doing it yourself, of course, if you look at all the other ways that you can fence, many, many dollars per foot on regular conventional fencing, and it's less than 87 cents a foot for electric fencing. So that is truly the way, if you can really maximize and figure out a way to divide your property with electric fencing, it's just the most economical thing you can do. Driving your own post, just if you can do everything yourself, that's going to be the biggest thing. I mean, if you pay somebody to do that project, it's going to be expensive. Realize if you're putting in corner posts and things like that, renting equipment to do that and whatnot. NRCS has grants right now. There's some states that have cost sharing up to 75%. So just look into that, get online and start looking into a rotational grazing NRCS grant that can help you with that, with not only fencing, but watering solutions as well. So if you're up against another neighbor that's got some similar issues and such, you can save 10 to 15% on your equipment by buying it in bulk in those situations. I don't know, rent fence paddocks. There's just all kinds of ways that if you're going to be looking at putting in brand new fencing, if your property has no fencing at all, that's one thing, and you're going to be faced with a perimeter fence. It's going to be somewhat costly. But even that can be done with electric fencing too, or just high tensile wire on line posts that are very, very inexpensive to put in. And especially, I mean, we have folks that have had fires and have burned their wood fences down, and they come in with a fiberglass post and put in wire, high tensile wire, and they can get that property protected relatively quick. So I'll tell you what, against all other conventional fencing, your electric fence is your best deal, and it's easy to put up. There's lots of help online. There's lots of help from us.
Mm-hmm.
If you get into a situation where you just don't know what you're up against, from answering questions about how to support a corner and building corner posts, and how far between the corner and the middle of the fence should I put another wood post in to support the fence. I mean, we have a really good publication. It's called Fencing 101.
Mm-hmm.
It's got all kinds of great tips and tricks in it that show folks how to do it efficiently and by themselves. Like I said, there's lots of help out there. There's lots of help and lots of tips that you can use to make it as inexpensive as you can possibly make it. So I know it's scary. I take it that this person has $1,000 fencing bill. This is a past tense thing, or I'm going to, like, I've already spent 20 grand. I want somebody to pay for it. That's one thing. But if you're looking to do a fence project, just look at all your resources online. And I know you're going to find all kinds of different good stuff out there.
Yeah, it could even be a quote of what, it could be, and then deciding how you're going to do it too. But I'm glad you mentioned NRCS because um, we have worked with NRCS with conservation programs, and so have other grazers in our area. And every state's a little bit different, but through the Equip Conservation Program,
Yep.
you can work with your county conservationist or regional conservationist to develop a grazing plan. And then from there, they look at what tools or resources are needed to help
Right.
support implementing that, which typically includes perimeter fence, portable fencing, water lines, other animal walkways. But it's more of a big picture grazing plan versus like
Yeah.
sometimes people think about where's the grant for the equipment, but it's more like the equipment comes with it as a part of
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
solution for doing that conservation practice, just kind of putting in scope that way.
Right.
I've also found that depending on what you're doing or where you live, sometimes there's other grant projects out there that will fund equipment. A lot of times, most of the or I guess many grants for farms don't fund equipment or infrastructure, but there are some that are out there. So I found that another avenue too would be there's the FACT, which is the Food Animal Concerns Trust,
Yep.
has some grants that will help support implementing grazing and pasture management tools and approaches. And then I've also found if you're somewhat near a metro area, that food co-ops will also sometimes have grants for farmers, and they're pretty
Yeah.
wide open with how you can apply and use those funds because they recognize that a lot of farmers who are doing direct market are often early in their farming career. They have more infrastructure needs that they need to get set up, and so, though something like this could apply for that as well too.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
But
Absolutely.
but yes, it's electric fencing for sheep and goats is no joke for a big investment. That's why sometimes those portable options work really good to
Yeah.
get started, and then you can start to figure out how do you want to set those perimeter fences up and what's the best option.
Well, it's a challenge, and I get it. We talk about how easy it is for cattle to be contained and managed with electric fencing, and because you've got an enormous body. The hair on a cow is short typically. They have a big hoof, so there's lots of surface area for the electron to go through their body into the ground and find but a sheep, a goat, very small footprint. I mean, the horns are not that conductive. Hair is not that conductive.
Mm-hmm.
But so when we are talking about, there has to be a physical and a psychological barrier for sure. It's more of a challenge more than any of the other animals that we work with that we contain, just because they can be kind of obstinate, and they're just lawnmowers, and
Mm-hmm.
but luckily they typically graze right up to a perimeter, and they know where to stop normally unless they're being pressured. But
Mm-hmm.
it's a good solution. We're very successful with that across the world, and I take a lot of note from our folks in New Zealand who, more sheep than not,
Mm-hmm.
and they use almost exclusively electric fencing to to contain. And we have some large goat herds here in Oregon that I work with that, yeah, they're very, very happy with their containment system. And they're doing the same thing we just talked about today and
Mhm.
having great successes with it too. So,
For sure. Well, as we wrap up, I guess since you've shared a lot of great approach and expertise related to sheep and goat fencing, I just want to give you a chance to maybe share a few of your favorite products from Gallagher that are work really well with goat and sheep grazing,
yeah,
just to give folks an idea of what options are available with your
well,
organization.
yeah, and we've talked a lot about the structure fencing, which is the sheep and goat net, which is very conductive and very easy to work with normally, and the smart fence, which is just fence into one itself and pulling it out and creating an area. But moreover, the energizers that are really, really changing technology-wise over the last couple of years. There's new lithium products out now that are just wonderful. A zero point 0.8 joule or what we call an S80 lithium is ideal for this kind of grazing for sheep and goat because it meets that near 1 joule, but it actually has a little bit a better output rating than even a typical battery energizer. So the portability and having something in the field that they can just turn it on and let it go with some peace of mind is awesome. Um, as I mentioned early on too, that the equipment that you can put in a barn and plug into the wall again is giving you can buy twice the power, 3 times the power in a 110 volt unit that you can plug in. But again, the downside is you got to run cable out of the barn up to the fence line and then attach it and that type of thing. But I think the number one thing that I'd like to leave you with is get a fence tester. They're about 50, $60. And a typical electrical tester is not going to work. It has to be an electric fence tester because we're working with so much more voltage. And the the voltage that comes through an electric fence where it's thousands of volts isn't going to hurt you because there's so very little amps that are in the electric fence. And that's what hurts you is the large amount of amps. You can have 115 volts coming out of the wall and 15 to 20 amps and that'll stop your heart if you're in the wrong place. But electric fencing, there isn't an animal on the planet that doesn't flinch from it and run away. But in order to make it effective, you have to have a high enough voltage for them to be respecting it. And that's where that tester comes into play to make sure that all that work that you put into making that fence up is working the way you want it to with that tester. And troubleshooting and making sure it is doing what you want it to do.
A great suggestion, and I agree. I keep mine in my gator, and it's a prized possession for making sure everything's running quite well. I guess as we wrap up now, too, do you have any other final words of advice or thoughts as it comes to sheep and goat fencing?
Well, you guys, you have a bit of a challenge, as I mentioned early on, and just understand your resources out there. I know that what you are doing and giving folks advice is such a gift, and we're all here to help you. We're all here to help in any way we can. It doesn't have to break the bank. They can be contained, and they will respect an electric fence. So yeah, just start researching. Start looking at what you have right now. Look at the equipment that you already have in your own place right now and try to make it work. There's no need to go out and get crazy. So just know that it's easy to put up, it's easy to work with typically, and just have fun with it. Don't touch it. And use good grounding.
Mm-hmm.
Don't forget about grounding your fence line because it doesn't work without it. And, yeah, that's about the best I can say is those 3 or 4 points is that that's what makes it work for sure.
Well, thanks, Ray, for being here today and answering these questions. It's always fun to, we've talked before, so it's always fun to hear your
Yeah,
knowledge and expertise, and especially from the very much from the technical side and operation side of things. So I
thank
appreciate
you.
your time today and answering these questions.
Well, Leslie, it's been my pleasure.
All right, we are good. So thank you so
Okay.
much for spending time with me this morning, talking about probably
Yeah,
the probably more wild side of livestock. So
it is. Yeah, it's definitely the wild side of animal containment, but hopefully this doesn't lead you to too much editing. I get a little bit rambling. Don't be
that's
afraid to cut
okay.
me off in the middle of a sentence by any means. So,
All right. Well, sounds good. Yeah, I'm gonna after this, I'll go through and I'll kind of do a little bit of editing work, but I think for the most part, we should be pretty good.
okay. Well, you take care and thanks again and anytime. So,
All right. Thanks, Ray. I appreciate
okay,
it.
but
Have a good day.
bye-bye. You too.
Bye.